Okay, Proverbs 13:3 says, "Whoever guards his mouth preserves his life, and he who opens wide his lips comes to ruin." Sometimes speaking up is a good thing. It's a good idea. But sometimes it's better to kind of keep your trap shut a little bit, okay? And that can be hard to measure. It can be hard to figure out, when do I speak up, when do I not? Right? We all have opinions, we all have thoughts, ideas, and it's like, should I talk or should I not talk? And I was thinking about words this week, and sometimes words can just stick in your head, right? And they just kind of stay there, and you think about them for a while. And I decided I want to give you guys a test this morning. I haven't done one of these in a while, so I want to see if you guys could finish the sentence for me, /song or whatever it is, okay? If you grew up Midwest, you ought to be able to finish this one, all right? You save big money when you... All right. We're going to do that one during worship next week. All right, here's another one. Let's see if you guys can finish this one. Less singing this time. All right. Jay Jansen, one name. Says it all. Okay, all right. Now, we had our Christmas play back in December, and during rehearsals, Drew Freeball had this line where he would say, "We are an old established law firm," but the way he kept saying it sounded very similar to something else. So I'll see if you guys can finish this one. "We are farmers." All right, good job. You guys watch way too much TV, so that's good to know. I'm going to show you guys a commercial, and I thought some of you would find this nostalgic, but I realized during second service that it actually says California right on it. So, very few of you are probably going to know this commercial, if you know it at all. If you don't know it, that's okay, because it's a really good commercial. Let's go ahead and show this.
Tom, can I make a suggestion?
You're fired!
Welcome to eternity.
Flowers grow low, then they die. Rivers flow low, then run dry.
Heaven!
But a kiss is a kiss for all time.
Wait a minute. Where am I?
Got milk?
All right, anybody in here remember that commercial? Hey, all right, wow, that's awesome. I was really expecting nobody. When I asked that in first service, it was the front row where my family sits, were the only people that raised their hands. So, question about that, right? Do you think that guy might have wanted to reconsider what he said to people in his lifetime? Reconsider the way that he behaved, right? I think he probably would. The reality is that it's important that we think about the words we say and how we act towards other people and stuff like that. But in today's day and age, we have to worry about more than just what we say out of our mouth, right? What does Mariners catcher Steve Clevenger, Mavericks point guard Kyrie Irving, and U.S. Olympic skier Aaron Blunk have in common? They were all suspended because of tweets that they put out. Right? Today we have to worry about more than just our mouths. We have to worry about what our fingers say as well. Sometimes it's better to keep our fingers shut. You guys remember George Zimmerman? He was the guy that shot Trayvon Martin several years ago. Well, Spike Lee, of course, was upset by what had happened, and in order to get revenge, he decided that he was going to take George Zimmerman's address and post it publicly on social media so people could go harass him and stuff like that. And the problem was, though, is that when Spike Lee posted that, he posted the wrong address. And so everybody was harassing somebody who was completely innocent of the situation entirely. So they sued him, and they won $10,000 for one tweet. Did you know that one tweet of somebody's address could cost you $10,000? Should have kept his fingers shut, right? Sometimes we have to be quiet because voicing our thoughts, even as well-intended as they might be, may change our future. And so today we're going to learn about Ishmael making that same mistake, speaking up in a way where he probably shouldn't, and the repercussions of that, okay? If you're following along with your YouVersion Bible app this morning and you're looking for today's event, it's called The Other Son. If you're going to look at your regular Bible, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 21, looking at verses 9 through 21. Now, last week we ended with verse 8, and I want to give you just a quick reminder of what verse 8 said. It said, "And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned." Okay? So Isaac is now an age that we don't exactly know, but he's weaned. Estimates, scholars think it's somewhere between the ages of 1 and 12. Yes, some people actually believe that people were not weaned from their mother until they were 12, which seems creepy, but apparently that's the way that things worked back then, or at least some people think so. So we know that, Isaac has been alive for probably closer to 2-3 years, something like that, right? He's young. He's very small, toddler probably. And so him and Ishmael are 13 years apart. Remember, Ishmael was born from the slave woman. So Abraham has 2 sons, Isaac, who was about 2, and his other son Ishmael, who's about 13 years older, something like that, okay? So let's go ahead and hop in and see what the inevitable thing is going to be. Genesis 21:9. It says, "But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing." Okay, a better word there for laughing might actually be more like scoffing. All right, so we have Ishmael sitting over in the corner. His little brother is now weaned. They're throwing a big party. And Ishmael's got a problem with it, right? I hate that stupid kid. Why is he even here? Oh, yeah, Isaac. Everybody's so excited about Isaac. What about Ishmael? Right? I was the guy. I was the one that was the only one. Abraham is in charge of this whole camp, and I was his only son, his oldest son, and now this kid Isaac comes along. So there's an issue there. There's tension, right? And as a response to this, we find out that women have the potential to do some really evil stuff. Now, don't get me wrong. Men do too. I'm not saying that men don't. But in this case, we're looking at women and the way that they happen to pursue evil, at least in this version of the story. I found a quote this week, and it's anonymous, probably because the person who said it is dead. But it says, "Telling an angry woman to calm down works about as well as trying to baptize a cat." Okay? So if we think about that, right? I don't know if you're offended or not. I hope you're not. But the reality is nobody's reading that doesn't get it. Okay? We understand that there is potential there for things to happen. All right? Angry women have the ability to do some terrifying things. Again, men do too, but we're talking about women today. If we think about what happened in Genesis 16:4, we know that Hagar was really snooty with Sarah, her master, right? Genesis 16:4 says, "And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress," right? So if you remember, Hagar got pregnant by Sarah's husband. And Hagar was walking around like, "You couldn't get pregnant, could you, Sarah? Check me out. Carrying your husband's baby." She got snooty with her. And Sarah had a problem, okay? And Sarah, however she responded, we don't know exactly what it was, but whatever she did terrified Hagar enough to where Hagar ran away. Sarah got a little crazy, which I think is understandable, all right? Now, Sarah has a son. And I think Sarah's ready to get a little bit snooty herself. Right? "Oh, check this out, slave woman. I had a baby too." All right. And then what starts to happen? Well, I think Sarah starts to get upset because she's looking over and she sees Ishmael at her son's party, and Ishmael's over here talking trash about Isaac, complaining, whining, maybe being disruptive during the party. I don't know what he was doing, but whatever he was doing was enough to make Sarah really angry. All right? Now, the reality is that Ishmael should still appreciate his role. Right? The wise thing to do would be like, "Hey, you know what? Yeah, I'm number 2, but at least I'm number 2. But he's not like that. He's like, "You know what? I want to be number 1. If I don't get all the benefits of being number 1, then I'm not happy." He's the son of the leader of the camp. He should be satisfied, but he's not. Have you ever experienced something like that? Maybe you're on one or the other side here where maybe you're like the popular kid in the group, and then somebody else comes along who's better looking or more popular than you, and you don't like that. Or maybe you work really hard at work, you build up a reputation for being a hard worker, some new guy gets hired and he works really hard too, and they start bragging about him. It's like, he ain't that good. Or maybe like you serve in a ministry with a team and you are always the go-to, and someone else comes on board, and then the leader of that ministry starts to go to them a little more, and you start to get a little jealous, right? And what do you do as a response? You start gossiping about them behind their back. You start hoping that they stumble, even looking like, "I'm going to wait for you to trip up and I'm going to call you out." Or you start building dissension within the group. You start to get like a little coup going on, right? Well, here's your first fill in the blank this morning. If you're filling in your blanks, you grabbed your card on the way in. Here's your first one. Jealousy and envy are poison to a community. Jealousy and envy are poison to a community. That's what Ishmael's doing. He's just hating on the new kid, and he's causing problems. And he's probably been doing it for a while. He's probably been doing it ever since Sarah got pregnant. right? So this has probably been an issue. Now, let me ask you something, right? Ishmael is a teenager, 13, 16, something like that. Isaac is 2 or 3 years old. Who do you think is causing the problem between those two? Is it the 3-year-old? Maybe. But here's the thing, if there's a teenager in the equation, it's probably the teenager. I mean, that's just how it goes, right? So in this case, there's clear tension between these two, and it's starting with Ishmael, okay? Matter of fact, Ishmael and Isaac still can't get along even to this day. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's go ahead and jump into Genesis 21:10. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. So Sarah's ready to be done with Hagar and Ishmael. She wants them gone. Get out. Which is interesting to me because isn't the reason Hagar got pregnant, wasn't that Sarah's idea? Yes. It was. Sarah's like, hey, you should go impregnate my maidservant. Then she gets pregnant. It's like, I'll kick him out. It's like, wait a second, Sarah. Like, this was your doing here. But the reality here is that Sarah is saying more than she knows. This is kind of an unintentional prophecy, if you will. She's speaking about the future, but she doesn't even probably realize that that's what's going on. God is telling this part of the story specifically for people like you and me, okay? Let's turn to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 21. It talks about this very passage, what Paul's saying here. It says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise." Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants, okay? So Paul is saying that God used the story of Isaac and Ishmael as symbols for his covenants, his 2 covenants. All right, we're talking about 2 different ones. All right, let's keep going here. Galatians 4:24, it said, "Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar." Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. Let me ask you this. What covenant of God came from Mount Sinai? You guys remember like the 10 Commandments and like Moses and all that stuff on Mount Sinai, right? This was the law. That's what he's talking about. The promise that came from the law was one of slavery. Why? Why is that considered slavery? Well, because honestly, the reality is that all that was an illustration that we can't follow the law. That was the purpose of the law, to show us that we're not good enough to do it. If I made a rule in church, starting today, new rule, no breathing in church, what would happen about 10 minutes from now? Everybody in this room would either be dead or breaking the rules, right? Because it's impossible. In a sense, we're slaves to oxygen. We can't help but breathe, right? Well, that's kind of what this law was, right? God says, here's the law, follow it perfectly, and come to find out, as sinful humans, we can't do it. We don't have the ability. So that's why we find out we are slaves to sin, okay? But there's another promise here that Paul's talking about. Let's keep going here in Galatians 4:28. "Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman." Remember, he's quoting Sarah directly here. "Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman." What he's saying there is there's this old covenant, which Hagar illustrates, that is the covenant of slavery, revealing that we're slaves to sin. But there's this other covenant of promise from God, which promises freedom. And that's the covenant that comes through Christ, okay? Here's your next fill in the blank. Our inheritance comes from promise, not slavery. Christ and his promise is what brings us the gift of freedom. And this was painted by God using Sarah's words some 1,900 years before, okay? So let's get back to the Genesis story. So Abraham, as a result of what's going on here, right? Sarah says, kick this kid out. Abraham's struggling with this. Why? Because he loves his boys. Right? I don't know if you guys know this, but I have 2 kids, Ronnie and Grace, and Ronnie is not my biological son. I love him the same as if he was my biological son, but the reality is that he's not. And there are some external implications because of that, right? If I go to the doctor and they're trying to find out about genetic diseases, well, there's no point in asking me. He doesn't have my genes in him, right? So that's an external reality. As much as I love him, that's still the reality outside. When he was younger, I used to be really afraid, like, man, what would happen if something happened to Tosh, if she died, and then his biological dad wanted to take custody of him? Would I have any recourse? Would I be able to do anything? That was a fear I had. It's an external reality. And that's what's happening here. Abraham loves both of his boys. They're both his sons, but there are external realities that go with that. And so he has to face those external implications. What do we do with this? And notice what Sarah said. Sarah said, cast out this bondwoman and her son. You know what that sentence is missing? Question mark. She's not asking Abraham, Abraham, will you cast out this bondwoman? No, she says, cast him out, cast her out, get him out of here. They're gone. She's giving an order out of anger. Okay? You remember what happened last time there was tension between Hagar and Sarah? Back in Genesis 16:5, it says, and Sarah said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. And then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. Okay? So Abraham said, well, she's your servant. Do whatever you want to her. I don't care. And she was so mean to Hagar that Hagar ran, and she only came back because God told her to go back. See, this is a problem. You ever wonder why God tells women to be submissive to men and men to be head over the women in the family? I know this is a hard thing the Scripture says for women. I get that. I know a lot of women that are like, but I don't want to be under the headship of my husband. He's an idiot. Well, you picked him, right? But I get that, right? I get it. I get the struggle there. Well, honestly, I think that there's several reasons why God does this, but I'm going to talk about just a couple this morning. One of them, I think, is that it's partly because women know how to exercise their authority, whether they're called the head or not. Women just know how to do that. They're good at it. Has anybody ever heard of a woman named Anne Boleyn? Right, a historical figure. She married King Henry VIII. The ambassadors of Milan and France both said it was essential to have Anne's approval before you tried to do anything with the English government, which was interesting because they said that before she was even queen. As a regular woman, no royal status, you had to have her approval to do anything with the English government. She had power without title. Women know how to do this, right? And the king said, hey, I want you to be my mistress, Anne Boleyn. And she said, no, because I want to be queen. I don't want to just be your mistress. So, of course, King Henry VIII went to the Catholic Church and said, hey, Catherine of Aragon, she's not giving me any heirs. I want a divorce so I can marry Anne. And the Catholic Church said no. So King Henry split from the Catholic Church and started the Church of England so he could marry this woman. Tell me women without titles don't have power. I don't believe that for a second. Women know how to do that. So the reality is I think that God had to give headship to the men because we need a little help. On the other hand, though, I think men have a tendency to want to back down, to check out. Now, go ahead. You just do it. I don't care. That's exactly what we see Abraham do, right? That's what he did back then. She's your slave. You just handle it. I don't care what you do. And so God tells men, no, you better be checked in. You better have a part of this, okay? And so now Abraham's in a tough spot. He has a promised heir. The other son is scoffing and causing problems. And he has a very, very angry wife. And I think he feels stuck there. What do I do with this? And the truth is, it can be hard to be a parent and a husband or a wife, okay? If he sides with his wife here, he has to kick out his son. But if he sides with his son, he has to go against his wife. There's no good answer for him. He only has bad choices here. And sometimes I hear from moms and dads that they feel stuck between their spouse and their kids. Right? I have to protect my kids from my spouse, or my kids will just run over my spouse if I don't do something, right? They feel caught in between. Sometimes I see like a kid will be asking for money, like, trying to move home after they mess up, and one parent will say, no, they need to learn. And another parent will say, well, no, we need to help them. And then it becomes, do I refuse my child or do I go against my spouse's wishes? What do you do in those moments? Well, last time, Abraham just told his wife, do whatever you want. I don't care. It's your problem. Well, this time he makes a better decision. Abraham gets counsel from God. Let's look at Genesis 21:12. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac your offspring shall be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So it's wise here because it can be tough to go between mother and child or father and child or whatever. But Abraham is wise because he goes to God for counsel. What does God say? What does the word of God tell me I should do in this situation? Because that's the choice when there is no good choice to make. And God makes his answer very clear. He says, Abraham, be on the same page with your wife. Actually, that's your next fill in the blank. Spouses should be on the same page with God. All three should be in agreement, husband, wife, and God. That's the pursuit of how you figure out how to make a decision. And so many times I see spouses not on the same page. You know, one of the phrases I hate to hear is when somebody says, don't tell my wife, or don't tell my husband. Sometimes I say it as a joke. I'll be like, hey, I'm going to eat this donut, don't tell my wife, right? And I say it as a joke, but I probably shouldn't even joke about that. Because really, it's extremely unhealthy to hide things from your spouse. Like when someone's like, here, son, take $100, don't tell your mom. Here, honey, take my car for a week, don't tell your dad. That's extremely unhealthy behavior, right? What parents should be coming together and working things together. And in this case, God says, be on the side of your wife, Abraham. But he also gives a very specific instruction to Abraham, which is different than what Abraham did last time. God says, do as she tells you. He didn't say, Abraham, check out and tell her what to do. He says, Abraham, you do this. You do this. Don't just give her permission and check out. Now, many of us might be hearing this going, man, that sounds kind of harsh, man. You're going to tell God to kick out? God's going to tell Abraham to kick out his son? Like, that seems kind of mean. Well, I think there are some things we need to realize about what's going on here. First of all, God promises to take care of Ishmael and give him a nation. So he's not just abandoning him to die or something, right? God's promising that he'll take care of him. Second, don't forget, Ishmael's not supposed to be here. He's not supposed to be alive. Right? So God's only saying, hey, I'm trying to get this back to my original plan that you messed up. Third, I wonder if Abraham is still doubting. I wonder if he wants Ishmael to be there as a backup. Just in case something happens to Isaac, this guy might have to be my heir. And I think God's making it clear there is no backup plan. There's just my plan. All right? Fourth, remember what we just read in Galatians 4. You compare Hagar and Ishmael to the flesh and Sarah and Isaac to his promise. And he's saying they will not have the same inheritance. So God wants to illustrate that. And then finally, God is making clear that the flesh, finally, we can't forget that the boy is at least 13 or 16, somewhere around that age group, okay? That's really important. Now, you might be thinking, man, you're going to send a 13-year-old out on his own? Well, 13-year-olds back then weren't as helpless as they are now, okay? Much less like a 16-year-old, okay? If you take a 13-year-old today, drop them off at Walmart without a cell phone, they'll be dead in a couple days, right? I mean, it's a different thing. Our culture has changed. Back then, you find a 13-year-old and they'll probably like, well, I've already murdered 20 people because I could, like they're trained in a specific set of skills and right? Like it was a different thing to be 13 back then versus what it is now. We live in a different society where we can take our time raising our kids. Back then, it was very different. You had a lot of much greater expectations when you started coming of age. I mean, girls were having babies at 13 very commonly, okay? So it was very different. So we have to understand that he's not sending Ishmael out as this helpless little kid. He's sending Ishmael out as somebody who can probably take care of himself by this point, okay? And we got to keep that in mind because this next passage, there's a little bit of dissection we got to do here that I think is kind of fun. It's also a little nerdy, so just a warning that that's coming up. Genesis 21:14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar. Putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, she sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. Okay. When you read that, even as it's translated here, it might be weird to picture this kid being 13, 16 years old. Like, it sounds like it's talking about a toddler, okay? But there are some translation issues here we have to discuss. Do you ever wonder, like, why are there so many translations of the Bible? Like, why don't we just have one? Well, translation is a tricky subject, okay? Anybody here take French in high school? Okay, a couple of us. What is a pomme de terre? I see you guys passed French with flying colors. Okay, pomme de terre, literally translated, means apple of the earth. Pomme de terre, okay? But the pomme de terre, when you think of an apple of the earth, that's not how we would translate it into English. We would translate that as potato. All right, pomme de terre is potato, but it literally means apple of the earth. So let me ask you this. Let's say you're writing the Bible and you're copying it from French and it says pomme de terre. How many of us in here would choose to translate that as apple of the earth? 1, 2, 3. Okay. How many would translate it as potato? Most of us, okay? Well, here's the thing. That's the kind of question they have to ask when they translate Scripture. Okay? Some, if you want to be more direct, like the King James or something like that, they'll take the words and literally translate them over, and they expect you that when you're reading it, you're going to do the work to check the translation and the context and understand the language rules and stuff like that to kind of figure out what it says. But some people go, nobody's going to do that when they're sitting there reading the Bible. They just want to know what it says. So let's just translate that as potato so they don't have to do the work to figure out what pomme de terre means or apple of the earth means, right? So that would be something more like the New Living Translation or NIV or something like that. Okay, those, they make some of the jumps for you so you don't have to do the research to understand it. But there's a problem. How do you know you're making the right jumps? If you're looking in the Bible, what if it wanted you to say apple of the earth? What if that's what they meant to say and you translated potato? That would mean your translation's wrong. So that's the issue with translating, is things aren't always linear. And that's one of the problems that we see in this passage. Actually, here in verse 14, there's an issue where the Muslims use this against the Jews and the Christians because they believe the opposite about Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is where the Arabic people come from and also where Islam comes from, okay? So they look at Ishmael as if he was the promised child because that's where Islam came from. And they look at this passage and say, the Jewish scholars clearly twisted this over time to make Isaac fit because everything that it's writing about Ishmael makes it sound like Ishmael is the kid. So they had to flip some things somewhere around verse 14. And when you look at it, you might go, it kind of does sound like they're talking about a kid. But there are some issues here, okay? First of all, how do we know that Ishmael was 13? Well, Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born. He was 100 when Isaac was born, plus weaning time. That means he's at least 13. Genesis 17 specifically says Abraham was 99 when he was circumcised, and Ishmael was 13 when he was circumcised. So right after that is when Isaac was born, so he's 13 to 16 years old, okay? Now, if we look at verse 14, this is where people start to get tripped up. Let's take a look at if it was literal, here's what it would look like. And took and a skin of water, and he gave to Hagar, putting on her shoulder, and the boy, and sent her away. There's a lot of ands in there, right? We would never say it that way in English. But this is where the issue comes from. So right here, this first and by the boy, there's three verbs here that we got to know about. There's took, gave, and putting. Those are the three verbs here. The reason we need to know that is because this next thing here, there's something called a direct object marker in that word and. What does that mean? Well, that means you take this direct object, the noun, and it means that it's relating to one of those verbs. This is the word that matches the verb. But which verb are we talking about? Well, a Muslim would say, well, clearly it's putting because that's the most recent verb. So this is saying that the boy was put on her shoulder. So you see, Ishmael was still a boy. He was the chosen one. But see, there's a problem. When you actually look at this, it's the problem's that the object marker is on the word and, which is weird. If that was true, it would just say the boy was on her shoulder, but it says and, which implies that it's a new idea. So really, this old idea should be in parentheses. It's a separate thought. And so that means you should go to the verb before, which means gave. So the translation should be that he gave Hagar the boy, which is why it's translated this way now. Now, I realize that's probably confusing, and that's okay. If you're confused, just know that if a Muslim ever talks to you and says that it was mistranslated, you can go, you know what? Dan one time told me something that I don't understand, but I know it's there. Let me give him a call. You can do that. Or if you want a little more study, in your YouVersion app, I put a link there to an article that you can do this study here and help you understand a little bit better. Otherwise, I don't want to take too much more time on it because I'm seeing a lot of brain spatter on the back wall. So we'll pull away from that here. Okay, so that's the thing about translation, right? I think it's actually pretty clear that Ishmael actually is 13. And you might be looking at this going, wait a second. Why do they keep calling him the boy? Well, actually, there's examples in scriptures where dads will call their son the boy. It's like today, if I could talk about Ronnie, who's 18 years old, and be like, oh, that's my kid. You wouldn't go, is he 3? Like, you would just, he's still my kid, even though he's a teenager, right? There's examples of 40-year-olds being called this, So that's not really the issue. But then you might be looking at this going, wait a second, it says that the mom placed him under the bush. How is that, if he's 16 years old, how is his mom placing him under a bush? Well, actually, the issue is that the word is a little bit scarier than placing, and they don't know what to do with it because it's actually more accurately throwing or tossing him under the bush. It's like, okay, well, nobody's tossing a 13-year-old under a bush, but do you know anybody that would toss a 3-year-old under a bush? Like literally throw them, cast them under the bush? Probably not, right? Most of us wouldn't. Maybe we want to, but we wouldn't really do that with our children, right? So here's the thing. What do we do with this? I think that we actually have to think about the situation here. Here's what I think was actually happening, okay? So Ishmael is being cast out. He's leaving the camp. He's with his mom, and he's angry. Stupid dad. Stupid Isaac. I hate him. Stupid. And then he looks at his mom. You know what, Mom? I'm sorry that we're here. And this is where they are. They're walking through the desert of Beersheba near the Negev. Semi-arid, very dry, hot. And I think he's upset with himself, upset with his mom, or his dad. And he probably feels guilty that his mom has been cast out because of the trash talking he was doing against his brother. And so I think he wants to step up his game, and he's, you know what, Mom, I'm going to hunt for you. I'm going to get some food. I'm going to find some water. I'm going to go ahead. You just sit here, Mom. I'm going to find some water. And he's going out looking, and he's pushing himself to the max, and he comes out. He's totally dehydrated, totally just wasted, and just comes back, and his mom looks at him like, oh, my gosh, my son. And she thinks he's going to die. And I think he passes out. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody pass out from being dehydrated, but when I was working in a paper mill, I saw a guy pass out one time. We were in a dryer section. It's like a big oven. We had to change this thing out, and they messed up, and they didn't evacuate the heat, and nobody could figure out why it was so hot in there, but it was in this rush to get it done. We were all in there, and it was like you had to keep moving your feet or your shoes would melt on the platform. It was so hot in there. And I'm like, I think I'm going to pass out. And I look over at the guy next to me. He's hungover, like he's really about to pass out. I look to the other side, and this other guy's in his late 50s, and he does pass out. He goes down. And somehow we picked him up and carried him down this ladder. I don't know how it was done, and we laid him out, and some guy in the back was like, take his pants off to cool him off. I've never seen a guy wake up so fast in my life. He was like, what? But anyway, here's the thing. Like when he went down, like he was just like lifeless. It was scary to see it, right? And so I think his mom looks at her son who just goes down. And in her effort to protect him, she tries to find shade, but you can see there's not a lot of shade options there, maybe a little bush. So I think she either grabs him by the hands or maybe under the armpits and just kind of drags him to a bush and heaves with her strength and tosses him underneath it to try to get him some shade. That's why I think she tossed her son under. And in that moment, I think he starts to recoup a little bit and he starts to call out. And then we see God respond. Let's look here in Genesis 21:17. Let's see how God responds to the voice of the kid. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. And so I think she takes him by the hand and helps him up, and then they start walking, and then we see that God follows through with his promise. Okay, I mean, what promise is Ishmael waiting for? Back in Genesis 16:9, it says, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. Okay, so here's the promise to Ishmael here. You shall call his name Ishmael because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So God is going to follow through on all those promises. He shows special favor to Ishmael because he's God's son. Here's what we learn from this, your next fill in the blank. When things seem hopeless, God can still move. When things seem hopeless, God can still move. And eventually, Ishmael does father a nation. And his descendants become the Arabic people, like I said. And today, you can still see hostility between Arabic people and Jews. Think about Palestine in Israel today. Right? There's still tension and conflict going on between these brothers. And so here's how God fulfills his promise, the last passage today. Verse 19. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So God gave water right there. I don't know if this was a miracle or if the well had been there the whole time. I don't know. But the truth is, God provided everything they needed because God had every intention of following through on his promise to Ishmael. Now, sadly, this is the last time we hear from Ishmael until Genesis 25 when he shows up at his dad's burial. So for all we know, he never sees Abraham again. But even in the midst of that, I want to recognize the goodness of God here. Because yes, the ultimate promise of salvation, Jesus, came through Isaac and his descendants. But what's interesting is that even though Ishmael wasn't a part of that, salvation was even offered to his descendants as well. Right, 1 John 2:2 tells us, he is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world, including the descendants of Ishmael. So God not only rescues Ishmael from death, he eventually offers eternal life to his descendants as well. And that tells us our last point this morning. God's hope is for everyone. Or God's hope is open to everyone, sorry. See, we can find hope in God because, honestly, we're really not any different than Ishmael, right? Any of us, we probably feel hated, maybe rejected, sinful. As a result, we might feel jealous and bitter and angry. We might be ruled out, kicked out, and cast out. And the truth is, we probably even deserve all those things, but the truth is that we find our hope in a God that forgives and always keeps his promise. And the best promise he's ever made us is that he would send his son to die for us. And he followed through completely. Our eternal life is secured because of God's kindness. And that even belongs to people like Ishmael and his descendants.